See, the beautiful thing about having nuance is we can have a both end experience. The reason we feel so much loss is because we feel so much love.
Right.
And so to be with that full nuanced reality is a wonderful, beautiful thing. And you know how John Hirschfeld has that beautiful metaphor of the spotlight on the books and the OCD person has the spotlight on the full range? It's not easy having that Shakespearean range of being able to notice everything. But when it's talked to you about how it's true, we can simultaneously feel the closeness to loss or death, but also we can feel the simultaneous closeness to life. And I think being able to hold that is so important, because the other sensitivity that we alluded to before is that people with OCD have a precocious existential sensitivity. They notice death way earlier. They're very aware, hyper aware, right? And it's almost like, imagine someone who was aware of existential truth, but never had the language to read Jean-Paul Sartre or Heidegger or any of the great existentialists, or they didn't have parents, let's say, who were able to say, no, it's not weird that you notice this or you worry about that.
Welcome to OCD Whisperer Podcast. Today with me, I have Dr. Michael Alcée, who is a clinical psychologist and mental health educator at the Manhattan School of Music in New York. His first book, Therapeutic Improvisation, illustrates how clinicians engage creatively with clients akin to jazz musicians and poets, while his forthcoming book, The Upside of OCD, redefines OCD as an empathic and existential sensitivity rather than solely a disorder. He has also contributed insights on psychology to TEDx, Psychology Today, NPR, the Chicago Tribune, and New York Times. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Christina.
So you and I were just chatting briefly, and I think that this is kind of relevant for anybody joining today, which is that, you know, there is a certain narrative and story we hear about OCD, which tends to be more how it's a problem, the disordered part, of course. I think there's enough of that, but it's interesting because with your approach and even the title of the book, The Upside of OCD, it kind of caught my attention because I was wondering, you know, like, yeah, we don't really talk about that. Or even if we do, I think that there's, for lack of a better word, perhaps sometimes that topic gets put down or a little shame. Like, how can there be an upside? If there is, it's maybe not even OCD or anything like that. So I think this is an interesting conversation to have about OCD and kind of, you know, hear your thoughts about first, like, yeah, what are we talking about when we're talking about the upside of OCD?
Yeah, it's strange because it's actually a misnomer, right? It's not really the upside of OCD. It's really the upside that comes before OCD hits the scene. Mm-hmm. And I love what you said. I think we don't focus enough on the person who has OCD. We focus a lot on the disorder when it gets to that. But the upside is this wonderful kind of these sparks of emotional sensitivity, these sparks of imaginative range. And by the time those sparks aren't kind of figured out how to be contained, they often become the 5-alarm fire that is OCD. So yes, I'm making a very bold new claim that I think OCD results from not being able to carry, contain, and express that wonderful fire.
That is interesting. And that is different. So I definitely know anybody listening right now would, I mean, ears might be perked saying, like, what does that mean? Right? Tell me what, like, right? Because I know OCD brains, the first thought is, oh, is there some other way to cure this? Is there some other way to work around this? Or, right? I don't know what that means. So let's dive into that. Yeah.
So, I mean, let's dive into the two characteristics, right? So people with OCD, Dostoevsky said something to the effect of, you know, a person who suffers the most is one with a great intelligence and a profound heart. That is the person who has OCD, because research shows that people with OCD are extremely empathic, almost overly empathic, to the point that they could lose themselves. This wonderful quality can go haywire when there's not enough self-empathy, not enough, like, connection with the full feelings that are your own. And so that emotional sensitivity is a wonderful thing, but when it's not balanced enough. So one of the reasons that my take is very different is that, unlike, I've studied all the CBT and ERP and ACT and all that stuff. And so I'm very familiar, and ICBT, which I think is wonderful. And I think one of the things that I think I would like our field with OCD to get is that we got to start with feelings first. When I think about OCD, I want to get to the heart of the matter. And most people with OCD feel so much, but they intuitively connect to it, but they don't have someone to help them mirror it back to say, this is what I'm feeling. This is all of what I'm sensing. And by the time they catch up with it, it's already converted itself into all these terrible obsessions and compulsions downstream.
Yeah. So you mentioned basically that there's a feeling component, right? And that people with OCD have, are very empathic, overly empathic. And a big piece of it is not connecting to like what's really underneath it and what's driving it. And that big feeling from what you're saying seems to be the issue. And what I'm saying is, well, it seems like from evidence-based practices, a lot of conversation is around like, yes, we acknowledge uncomfortable feelings, but we really get into more like the behavioral changes, the cognitive changes. And from what you said, it sounds like, well, it's more than that, or it's not just those things, or that there's actually a feeling, it seems, component that's pretty significant that you think needs to be addressed before anything else. So I wanted to understand more. What do you mean by that when you're saying that?
Yeah, it's surprising in a way, right? Because when I talk about feeling, it's that if you notice, somebody with OCD will pick up on all the feeling around and then they'll get affected by it. And then what do? Instinctively, where do people with OCD go? They go into their worrying mind to try and manage it. All the what ifs come up, all of the negatives come up. Now, my take is that if we did an exposure exercise with noticing the feelings, I feel a little bit angry at this person or unhappy about this, or I love this person, but they also really bother me. I feel conflicted. If I can be closer to being empathic to my own experience in a way, it's less likely for the OCD to jump into the imaginative mind. And because a person with OCD has such a border collie of a mind, so active, they will go to the races to find the negative. And so for me, it's not an either or. I think what behaviorists are doing and what ERP is doing is trying to be an exposure exercise for allowing yourself to entertain being with these difficult emotional possibilities. My take is that that's already really way down when the volume is turned up to 11. Mm-hmm. And I want to get it closer to when the volume is just turning up on those smaller emotions. And if we can notice that, so I'll give you an example. So you have somebody who has the classic fear of driving and maybe hitting a person or killing a person and worrying, oh my gosh, I need to constantly check. Now, at first you think, okay, what could this be about, right? This is just something they have to habituate to. They have to get used to going out there and not avoiding it, right? When I ask a person, let's say this person was a client, it's a composite. Let's say I ask Jennifer, right, a little bit more about what driving means and all the things connected to driving. And I find out, well, she's a new mother and she lives in a small street like mine, and she notices how fast the cars go. And she realizes how fragile that little kid is to her and how easily it could go away. And driving now becomes connected to this fear of noticing and being very tuned in, right? Now, let's say I keep on delving into more of the backstory around driving, and I come to find out that Jennifer's mother lost her father when she was very young. Boom, heart attack, no warning. And so throughout her life, she knew what it was like to have a mother who lost unexpectedly. And all of that loss gets like a magnet onto the obsession around driving. But without talking about any of the feelings, the context. I know people in ERP talk about, don't focus on the content, right? Because it's not important. I'm very interested in focusing on the context of these different aspects. And of course, what I think with people with OCD is have a very imaginative, expansive mind, and they're quick to go to all the what ifs. So my little mantra for people is, let's move away from the negative and go to the nuance. People with OCD actually are nuance noticers. They notice a lot. They actually notice too much, and then they don't have some place to contain it. And so one of the things that I think is really exciting is that when you see the richness of the OCD mind, like look at author John Green. His mind is so imaginative and so far-ranging when he talks about romance, when he talks about illness, when he talks about cancer and OCD and death and the environment. Now, I don't think that's just because he has OCD. I think it's because he has this sensibility before OCD even hits the scene. And that's the part that I want to rescue when we talk about OCD. And I actually think it goes along with working on the OCD when it becomes a disorder. And just like the ERP folks, I think doing an exposure exercise to really being with the full throttle feeling And the full throttle context adds a lot more.
Well, so this is interesting to hear, right? Because like you said, you also learned ICBT as a have I. And so like what it's just, this is where it starts just to me personally, not even professionally, but just personally, it's just such a fascinating process of when we start to, even in the profession, get nuanced about all these approaches, right? Where in many ways, I think a lot of things kind of can go hand in hand and weave together. But like ICBT, for example, talks about like in that example where, the goal here would be to not doubt unnecessarily that you're going to drive unsafely.
Right.
And there's no reason right now that indicates that like, you're not so overly exhausted, you're falling asleep at the wheel, right? You'd have to have certain things be actually happening for that to be relevant. So if those are not happening, but you do have, like you described, the past experience and other things that have occurred, because we all do, right? We all have associations with different things. It's just called living life and things that happen to all of us, right? And so,
I love that. Yeah.
Right. But like, it's true. And so, I mean, I've been vocal about like my recent experience, right? Like talk about cancer, right? My mom passed away, right? So like, here we go. I now have an experience I'm in, and all of us have that. It is, right? So what's the difference then with if we're able to work on that and notice, hey, like I right now, for example, don't have to sit here and obsessively doubt about having cancer, right? Like I trust and know that, I had my checkup, everything came back clear, and I'm doing the best I can. I can't be, projecting stuff in the future. Who knows?
Yeah.
I still have some associations and stuff, right? I'm still going to have certain things, but I definitely have feelings that come and go. But what's then the difference, I guess, right? Because this is where, like I said, it's interesting just in general. Yeah, like when we're talking about even ACT, right? We're talking about things like this, like noticing the value, noticing the experience you're in, noticing if it hurts a little, like, okay, let it hurt, but then we're moving on. We're kind of not getting stuck. So yeah, if you could just...
that. No, I'm going to answer your question, even about what you said about cancer and your mom and your own experience. See, the beautiful thing about having nuance is we can have a both end experience. The reason we feel so much loss is because we feel so much love.
Right.
And so to be with that full nuanced reality is a wonderful, beautiful thing. And you know how John Hirschfeld has that beautiful metaphor of the spotlight on the books, and the OCD person has the spotlight on the full range? It's not easy having that Shakespearean range of being able to notice everything. But when it's talked to you about how it's true, we can simultaneously feel the closeness to loss or death, but also we can feel the simultaneous closeness to life. And I think being able to hold that is so important, because the other sensitivity that we alluded to before is that people with OCD have a precocious existential sensitivity. They notice death way earlier. They're very aware, hyper aware, right? And it's almost like, imagine someone who was aware of existential truth, but never had the language to read Jean-Paul Sartre or Heidegger or any of the great existentialists, or they didn't have parents, let's say, who were able to say, no, it's not weird that you notice this or you worry about that. That would allow it to be formed. I call this the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. You know, that game that we played? Like, the Kevin Bacon is death in OCD. Every obsession or compulsion usually comes back to death. And I think actually it's one of the things that I want to kind of highlight and celebrate about people with OCD, that how wonderfully rich that capacity to live is. Now, the other thing that I alluded to before is that people with OCD have a hard time taking up space. They have a hard time feeling that they're entitled because they worry they're going to hurt somebody, or they're worried they're going to be responsible for this, or they're worried they're going to do something wrong. And so helping people with OCD own their power, own their authority, again, feeling, and that's the opposite of doubt, is having authority. But the beautiful thing about a person with OCD, so John Keats, the great poet, said something. He said, the job of the poet is to cultivate negative capability. Negative capability is the capacity to not just have reason to figure things out. It's to allow mystery and complexity and contradiction to be there. People with OCD have that. They haven't always had a language to put that together. And I think it's a beautiful thing. I think it's a quite poetic thing that that's why I'm so excited to write about this. And the funny thing is, you don't know that much about my background, but when I was in grad school, I worked with Dean McKay, a very big name in OCD research, and he allowed me to do a dissertation that brought all these things together. And it was like 20 years ago, and I thought, oh, surely OCD research is going to bring all this stuff in. I don't have to do anything. And I'm like, oh my God, they haven't done it. So that's why I wrote the book.
So tell me then, when you wrote this book, kind of what's your aim or what's something, because again, people listening and getting curious and like, okay, what is this, as we're talking through like the perspective shift that you're suggesting. And so what would you then, I guess, from your understanding and everything you've observed, what's your take on what do you think might be the steps then for somebody to go through, as they're working to getting better and stronger? And like you said, cultivating the ability to handle contradictions, to handle challenges, to the both and, which, I'm personally a firm believer in a both and
the paradox
mentality, period. Yeah.
I think so. There's 2 or 3 things I would say. One, this is about nature. If you have OCD, it's in your biology, it's in your wiring, and it's also a sensibility. This is part of who you are. You're built in a certain way. Just like, let's say 15 to 20% of the American population are highly sensitive. I see OCD as a variant of highly sensitive. Emotionally sensitive, imaginatively sensitive. So first of all, I think it's important to know how you work and to embrace the beauty of it, and also notice the challenges of, oh my gosh, I'm an OCD person. I can pick up a lot. So sometimes I can take on other stuff. Notice this client, Jenny, who had this obsession. She was taking on her mother's trauma of losing her father. Didn't realize it, right? So it's really important to know that we're built differently if we have OCD, but that doesn't have to be a bad thing. That's why I want to reclaim the person before the disorder. And the second thing is that nurture is really important. How is this intuitive, imaginative, insightful, empathic sensibility nurtured? How is it validated? How is it supported? How is it discouraged or invalidated? When you're talking to someone who notices nuance, you have to help them put words to that. And I don't think there's enough, right, of that out there, both in our field as therapists, but also in the general community. So I think, working on that is in the relationships that support and foster a lot of the stuff that's on the upside, I think is so important. The other thing that I think is really weird, but interesting about OCD, and you probably have experienced this. I know I've experienced this in my lived life with OCD. So I often will get recently I got a toothache and I will perseverate and obsess about the tooth. And often I think it's the real thing, but it's distracting me. So OCD tends to distract us while it's trying to focus us. So what was the real issue? I had overextended when I was taking care of my 6-year-old son, and I was starting to really get tired and drained. And I didn't feel comfortable saying I needed a break. All of a sudden, I started to have this obsession about my tooth. Now, it was distracting me, but it was also focusing on me. And when I realized, when I'm not listening to my feelings, when I'm not noticing this mixture of, I need a break, I don't want to be a bad dad, I know my son wants to be with me, but I need a little bit of time. When I was with that mixture of feelings, all of a sudden the obsession melted away.
It's interesting because when you say that, part of what comes to mind is people talk about stress, right?
Yeah.
And you're kind of naming it. I think you're honing in a little more under like what's underneath that, right? Because stress is just such a big umbrella term, but it could be anything. It could be anything from I thought it was going to go a certain way, and then suddenly things don't, or I thought I could handle X, but suddenly I can't, or I've, over committed to different things, or, whatever. Maybe today I'm just more tired and I just don't have the energy or the capacity.
Tired, tired, hungry, bored, all of those things.
All that stuff.
Anything that brings up conflict is super important. See, that's where, and conflict around relationship. Am I being a good enough father, significant other, son, daughter, friend? All of these things are real big triggers. So I like to say that OCD has a unique kind of sleight of hand. It creates this kind of magic that tries to distract us, but we got to figure out where the hand really is. That's why I know, as much as people in ERP, for example, say OCD is kind of random and meaningless, don't give it any heed. I think it's meaningless in a way when it distracts, but I think it's meaningful in that there's usually a context. And that's what I mean about the upside is going back before it gets so out of control that you have no idea what it is.
Yeah. And can I go back? Because you said there's 3 points and I was tracking you. You were talking about OCD people notice a lot. There's the nurture component, and we just kind of talked a bit about that. And what was the last one?
So, the last one actually, I think, is this boundaries thing. I think people with OCD, because we're so tuned in, our boundaries can get blurry and we can lose our own shape. So Robert Frost, the great poet, said, first you be a person and then I'll be a person. And then we'll be as interpersonal as we please. And we can like thumb our noses at each other. I think people with OCD have a hard time holding on to their own shape without feeling like, oh my gosh, it could be affecting somebody or hurting somebody. So supporting them in owning healthy power, healthy authority is really, really important. Healthy agency, right? What is OCD but the doubter's disease? You lose a sense of your own agency, your own sense of perception, your own sense of what's okay. And I think part of that is because people with OCD get easily blurred. And for example, sometimes that's why people with OCD have a hard time carrying or being with their anger, being with some of those classic negative emotions, quote, negative emotions like jealousy, because they feel hurtful. And when you're so aware, when you're so empathic, that's really difficult. But it's possible to own that while also, I always joke around. I joke around to people with OCD. I say, I want to help you how to learn how to be an asshole a little bit, but not really an asshole, because you can never be an asshole because a person with OCD has too big a heart to really be an asshole.
Yeah, so that was literally one of the questions I had, because again, I know my audience. We know the audience. We're talking about OCD. OCD brains are concrete and specific. So like when you're saying, healthy agency and like these concepts that I just know somebody might be like, well, but how? How do you do that, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do I reclaim my agency? Because people often talk about, right, my self-esteem takes a hit, my sense of self takes a hit. So how do you? Yeah. How do you be a person first and have that healthy agency or reclaim a bit more of that?
Yeah. So one of the things that I want people with OCD is to trust their heart more and their intuition more, right? So remember that great quote by Pascal? He said, "The heart has reasons for which reason knows nothing." People with OCD have an extremely enormous heart, but they don't always trust it and they give it away way too easily. So, one of the things you're right is I want people with OCD to learn how to trust this thing that often hasn't been, because most people with OCD they will attract other people with OCD because they have a big heart and they're like, oh my gosh, I can feel that, right? And also the other thing is I want people with OCD to lend that big heart more to themselves, more permission.
Right, but the question is how, right? Like, how do I trust myself? Because, when we get into these conversations of intuition too, like people often will say like, oh my gosh, I'm so in the OCD aspect of things that I can't even decipher between what's my gut or instinct or intuition versus that. Or in my heart, I might be like, well, I know I don't want to X.
Okay, I have an example.
Right? Like
an example. So with that toothache, let's just say, right? Mm-hmm. So going down the rabbit hole for me was then brushing my teeth to see maybe it's not, is it checking in the mirror, right? Everything, asking my wife, all reassurance seeking, right? All this stuff. And I noticed that I was spiraling. And so then I said to myself, wait, hold on, pause. Almost like mindfulness. Let me pause for a moment. What else am I feeling? Wait, what was just going on before this hit me, right? Almost doing a little detective work to say, oh, wait, before this hit me, what was I feeling? I was feeling drained. I was feeling annoyed. I was feeling tired. Oh, I didn't want to feel that because I felt like I should be a really good dad. Oh, wait, I was feeling conflicted. Oh, all of a sudden. So it's both thought and feeling. It's bringing them back together. And concretely is noticing that the imaginative mind, the OCD mind, is going to go to the worst case scenario and is going to only go to the negative. I'm a terrible dad. I have this thing. And also maybe almost feeling like it's punishing me for being a bad dad and being a bad person. And then all of a sudden I'm gone. And then I'm out of touch with my body. So it's sort of also remembering if my mind is racing, let me try and metaphorically take a breath and try to get back to my body and my feelings and the context. And that context helps us say, what might this thing be helping me focus on that right now it's just distracting me? The tooth thing was distracting me. The real thing was that I needed space. And I felt guilty about that.
Yeah. And it sounds like there's definitely quite a bit of, self-awareness.
Well, that's the thing. Remember, people with OCD are extremely aware, and they often use that awareness very much for others. And I want them to use that same prowess with themselves.
Yeah, like turn it back. Yeah, right.
Turn it
You'll
back,
notice all the ways that you don't feel.
but turn it back with deep compassion. Like I always say to my clients, I always say, I'm sure there's a really good reason right now why you're feeling this. I'm sure there's a really, really good reason that we don't know yet. And that opens the door for a creative moment. So with people with OCD, I want them to use and capitalize on this very, very sharp mind and this very, very big heart in a way that's more creative, in a way that also is enhancing the self, not giving it away.
I love it. Well, this is, I think, a very honestly fruitful conversation. There's, I think, a lot in this. And I definitely want to encourage anybody listening to, get the book. Obviously, it'll be included in the show notes and kind of see what you think for yourselves. And I think that this might warrant, having another follow-up session, to be honest, together on an episode, because I think there's a lot more here than not. And I'm sure people are going to have questions or comments and so on. And I know as of right now, people can buy the book.
Yeah, it's up for pre-order and it comes out November 19th.
Amazing. So really soon for the holidays, guys.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for being on the show. And I usually ask guests before you leave, what would be one thing that you would like to say or kind of leave people with a tip, a motivation, anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I want people with OCD to realize that they have poet souls.
That's pretty beautiful. I love that.
And it's not easy to have a poet soul. But I would love for people with OCD to write more of that poetry and to embrace it.
I love it. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming on here.
Thank you for having me. This is a delight.
Awesome.